Thank you, Stéphane, for this presentation. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk in this quite remarkable setting. In the light of the spirit of this series of seminars on the history of science, you suggested that I devote my lecture to a presentation of the scientific premises of my own work and to how they relate to the French tradition in the social sciences. And in fact, this has led me to reflect on my relationship with structuralism, on the part that structuralism played in the development of my work, and on the influence that one of its key figures, Claude Lévi-Strauss, has exerted upon me. Lévi-Strauss was my doctoral supervisor, and he was in fact an ideal one in that he let me entirely free to organize my work as I wished, to the point that he politely declined to read my dissertation before I gave it at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales before the defense, saying he had entire confidence in my abilities. So that I had, of course, no idea of the kind of critical comments he would make during the formal defense. In fact, they mainly concerned my style, which he found too ornate. I had asked Lévi-Strauss to supervise my thesis because, for a variety of reasons. First, because reading Triste Tropique when I was perhaps 16 or 17 was probably the initial shock that led me finally to become an anthropologist. However, I decided to read philosophy first, but I was among the very few students at the École Normale Supérieure who did not limit themselves to reading Lévi-Strauss's more philosophical work, like La Pensée Sauvage or Anthropologie Structurale, but also studied the more technical books, such as the Elementary Structures of Kinship and the first volumes of the Mythologique, which had been published already. So I greatly, of course, admired him. And when I finally took upon myself to ask his secretary for an appointment to expose my doctoral project, I was as intimidated as if I had been to visit Kant in Königsberg. Here at last was a huge figure of the social sciences, someone who was able to deal with arcane social facts by showing how they followed a complex logical pattern, and doing this with the clear and incisive mind of a great philosopher and the elegance and the sensibility of a great writer. Lévi-Strauss was also, I have to add, at the time, the only person in Paris who was qualified to supervise doctorates on Amazonian Indians. And although he was very close to retirement, this was among the reasons why I asked him to be my supervisor. However, both during the time I was struggling to write my dissertation on the relationship between an Amazonian people and its environment, and for a few years after, when I began teaching at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales myself, I did not at all have the impression that I was a committed structuralist or that I was following a structuralist method. As was quite common at the time, my theoretical outlook was an improbable mixture of Gallic Marxism, Gramscian semiotics, Husserlian phenomenology, and Lévi-Straussian structuralism, with small pinches of Marshall Sahlins, of Mary Douglas, of Edmund Leach, and more exotic authors such as Gilbert Simondon, Georges-André Audricourt, or Nicolas Gergetsky-Rögen. Within this eclectic combination, I had the impression that structuralism was just a component and certainly not a driving force. And it was only when I began to give papers abroad and when the audience would react to what I just said by qualifying it as a structuralist outlook that I realized how deeply I was or I had been influenced by Lévi-Strauss and structuralism. In fact, I was not unlike Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's The Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who, upon learning the meaning of the word prose, exclaimed, well, for more than 40 years I've been speaking prose without knowing it. So I'd been a structuralist without being fully aware of it. And this lecture will thus have a rather personal tone, for which I hope to be forgiven, as I will endeavor to make amends for my initial blindness by trying to state some of the merits of structuralism and explaining how I came to use some of its basic methods and intuitions. It might be apposite to begin by stating briefly what, in my view, constitutes the originality of structural anthropology. There is a dual aspect to it. One is a method for knowing and analyzing certain types of social facts inspired by structural linguistics that Lévi-Strauss and a few others have used with great success. But it is also a particular point of view on the very nature of social facts and on the epistemological conditions of getting to know the phenomenal world, which Lévi-Strauss has developed alongside his method, and which came to represent for most observers outside anthropology, primarily the philosophers, the heart of his doctrine. Now, one can take advantage of the method without, for all that, sharing the whole gamut of moral and philosophical convictions, which conditions the Lévi-Straussian vision of human experience, a vision that Lévi-Strauss, in fact, himself had never any desire to impose upon anyone else. What does the method consist in? According to Lévi-Strauss, it requires first to isolate sets of phenomena that are suited for this kind of analysis, essentially those that belong to what he calls, in a still very Marxian vocabulary, the superstructures, that is, elements of the world that the unconscious activity of the mind reputedly organizes in significant and systematic sets. The roots of kinship and marriage, classifications, myths, food norms, artistic forms, etc. In those systems, one looks for the relations, realized or potential, which connect elements characterized not by intrinsic properties, but by their positions vis-à-vis one another. In fact, the aim is to bring to light in a table of permutation the whole set of possible combinations between these elements. And the structural method which results from this operation does not aim at all at a faithful description of any social situation. It is a heuristic device which provides the syntax of the transformations which allows one to move from one variant to another variant within a class of phenomena. So the basic principle of structural analysis was very aptly defined by Jean Pouillon, who was a close collaborator of Lévi-Strauss, when he wrote, I quote him, "Structuralism, properly speaking, begins when one admits that different sets can be brought together, not in spite, but in virtue of their differences, that one then tries to order." So strictly speaking, structural analysis in anthropology amounts to that. It reveals and orders contrastive features so as to discover the necessary relations organizing certain sectors of social life, such as the set of culinary techniques, all the ways to exchange potential spouses between individuals and groups. In sum, it is a very efficient method to reach the objective which any anthropological analysis should aim at, that is, detect and order regularities in statements and practices. To this general method, one must add a point of view which is properly Lévi-Straussian on the nature of sociality and on the purpose of the anthropological inquiry, with which one may partially agree or wholly disagree. I may say a few words about some aspects of it with which I am particularly concerned. The first one is the marked semiological inflection of Lévi-Strauss' approach, because for him, social life is a network of exchange of different kinds of objects which circulate like linguistic signs. Language provided him initially with a model for the whole of social life and offered to him a hope that the study of social life might one day become as scientific as the study of languages. So language and the language-like properties of symbols are thus fundamental for him, both in their Saussurean dimension, that is, meaning as arising out of contrastive features, and in their praxeological dimension, that is, social interactions envisioned as an exchange of linguistic signs. And what Lévi-Strauss sometimes calls the symbolic function is in fact a language-like ability of humans to give sense to the world by detecting in the world salient features that can be organized in contrastive sets. Now, the emphasis put by Lévi-Strauss on symbolism and symbolic signs presents a problem for anthropologists like myself, whose ambition is to widen the scope of the social sciences to accommodate in the social sciences more non-human beings, and thus to shift the focus away from the sociocentric analysis of conventions and institutions towards the interactions of humans with and between animals, plants, physical processes, artifacts, images, and other forms of beings. For Lévi-Strauss, both anticipates in a way this project and conflicts with it. He anticipates this project because he assumes, in the Mythologique, for instance, that the world is not to be seen as the exclusive playground of humans, but as a vast array of meaningful differences between qualities and beings that can be systematically organized according to these differences. So what I see implied there are the premises upon which I have been working, that the sources of the plurality of beings and of regimes of existence lie at a deeper level than the sociocultural one traditionally studied by anthropology and the social sciences in general. This level, which, to borrow from Husserl, may be called anti-predicative, is the one where humans and non-humans become aware of each other and develop modes of relating prior to the usual processes of categorization and communication embedded in historically and linguistically contingent frameworks. However, these non-anthropocentric assumptions are at the same time contradicted by Lévi-Strauss's dependency upon the language-like properties of social life. If one yields to this dependency, one fails to purge anthropology of its anthropocentrism, because non-humans, devoid of linguistic abilities and capacities for symbolism, will always remain the passive objects of human cognition and inventiveness, mere bundles of qualities that humans detect and organize in symbolic patterns. So if non-humans are to become agents in their own right, agents of social life, then they have to be able to escape this symbol-induced passivity. There are several strategies to circumvent this problem, but I must admit that none is entirely satisfying. For example, one may focus on non-symbolic signs, images, for instance, iconic signs, and study how these signs behave as iconic agents in the mesh of social life. This is what I've myself attempted to do in the past years. I'm finishing a book on this topic. Or one may adopt an approach in terms of Gibsonian affordances, giving some active leeway to the object represented for this object to draw the perceiver in its sphere of influence. This is, for instance, the strategy that has been adopted by Tim Ingold. Or one may try to avoid altogether the use of the word symbolic and symbolism, even eschew the very idea of representation, thus hoping that the process they qualify will just disappear as problems by not being referred to. And this is the most common strategy, especially in the United States. Another solution, which was propounded recently by Eduardo Kohn in his book, How Forests Think, is quite attractive, but poses problems of its own. Kohn follows Peirce's triadic semiology, and he argues that iconic signs, that is, signs that share likeness with what they stand for, and indexical signs that are in a relation of contiguity, spatial or temporal, with what they represent, have to be brought into the anthropological agenda, not only as supplements to symbolic signs and to enrich human semiosis, but also because icon and indexes are the signs that non-human organisms use to represent the world and communicate between life forms. So their study would offer a way to bring together humans and other living beings within a more embracing semiosis, and would provide a foundation for an anthropology which Eduardo Kohn calls beyond the human. In other words, there is no need to shun representation as if it were a sort of malevolent and Eurocentric process of dissociation between things and words that impedes a true access to and a wholesome experience of the richness of the world. For there are other forms of representation than those which use symbols, so that making present something absent converts all beings who possess this disposition, that is, all organism according to Eduardo Kohn, into selves. So the forest who thinks by itself is an interesting way out of the forest of symbols, which has restricted until now, the scope of anthropology. Or perhaps we had better call this new science and ecology of relations. But it is far, far from solving all the problems of anthropocentrism. In particular, as I have argued elsewhere, it restricts agency to semiosis, to organisms, thus leaving unaccounted for a great number of non-humans and non-semiotic agents, nevertheless playing an important role in the social fields, from artifacts to the climate, for instance. So now let us return to Lévi-Strauss. A second matter of concern with his idiosyncratic view of social life is the enigmatic role played by what he called the unconscious, l'inconscient. According to him, the unconscious activity of the mind accounts for the structure and the functioning of symbolic systems, their variable contents being a contingent effect of the physical and historical environments within which these symbolic systems are deployed. Hence his well-known statement that anthropology is first of all a psychology. Although I'm convinced myself that a considerable part of our cultural dispositions is acquired, used, and transmitted in a non-conscious way, I'm rather reluctant vis-à-vis the Lévi-Straussian project of extracting from the black box of the unconscious little pieces of objectified thought embodied in institutions so as to deduce from them laws of the operation of the mind, rather than deducing these kinds of dispositions from the social expressions that they render possible, as Lévi-Strauss does. I find it more reasonable to give cautious credit to what cognitive psychology has begun to teach us about the mechanisms allowing the acquisition and stabilization of non-propositional knowledge. Finally, I share with Lévi-Strauss a general monist gnoseology, which is marked both by a rejection of the Cartesian type of cognitive realism and by the assumption that there exists a physical continuity between, as Lévi-Strauss says, the states of subjectivity and the properties of the cosmos. Although I find such an epistemological outlook in other authors too, in Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in Francisco Varela, in James Gibson, or even as Lévi-Strauss himself acknowledges in Spinoza. So if we leave aside Lévi-Strauss' personal views on the nature of social life and on the philosophy of knowledge, and return to the method of structural anthropology, what the latter brings compared to other great interpretive models of social phenomena, such as historical determinism or functionalism, is simply the idea that no human phenomenon has a meaning in itself, that it only becomes relevant when it is contrasted with other phenomena of a similar kind. A system of marriage with other systems of marriage, a variant of a myth with other variants of a myth, so that the object of the inquiry is less the description of the phenomenon than the logic of its contrasts. This method often proved to be highly productive, in particular because it pushed into the background the question of causality, whether environmental, cognitive, technical, functional, economic, political, ideological causality, which has, in my view, vitiated for a long time all attempts at explaining social facts. Indeed, it gives preeminence to the conditions of composition of common worlds. That is, the principles which govern the compatibility and incompatibility between institutions, practices, ideological systems, sets of values, techniques, forms of exchange, etc. It is thus more faithful to the mission of anthropology as I see it, or as I understand it. This mission, in my view, is to bring to light these principles of composition, to understand why, in given circumstances, some elements have coalesced in a certain way to create polities of a certain kind. It is also to explain why these relations of compatibility and incompatibility recur under similar forms in very different parts of the world. Why certain features do or do not mix harmoniously with others. So structural anthropology is a very efficient tool for revealing the laws of coalescence of these aggregates, precisely because it is attentive to the systematics of differences and because it eventually allows the integration within a unified model of local structures elicited from different fields of practice. Technically, structural anthropology achieves the ends I've just sketched thanks to a very original tool which I've also used myself with profit. This tool is transformation. According to Lévi-Strauss himself, transformation is the keystone of the type of analysis which he practices, and it is also what I find most fertile in his approach. Lévi-Strauss borrows from linguistics, as we all know, the notion of structure, understood as a system of contrastive oppositions. But he endows it with an analytical dynamism which results from the capacity of the structure to account for the ordered transformations between models of a same group, that is, models which are applied to a same set of phenomena. So a structure is not a system. One has to emphasize this. A structure is not a system. For a structure to exist, there must be between the elements and the relations of various sets invariant relations which allow moving from one set to another by the means of a transformation. Now, Lévi-Strauss uses the operative tool of transformation in two quite distinct ways, which relate to two different morphogenetic traditions, and this is where we enter into the history of science. That of the biologist Dorothy Wentworth Thompson, on the one hand, whom Lévi-Strauss claims to follow, and that of Goethe, to whom he pays lip service, let's say. And it is the latter which directly inspired me. The Goethean type of transformation is the one that Lévi-Strauss implements, for instance, in the elementary structures of kinship, although he does not say so himself, but states instead that he was inspired in that book by Darcy Thompson. In the analysis of marriage systems, I don't know if you're very familiar with the book, which is an arcane one, but still a very important one. In the analysis of marriage systems that the topic for this book, the invariant relation is the exchange of women as an expression of the principle of reciprocity, which is itself the positive form of incest prohibition. That is, men abstain from women of their own group and give them to men of another group so as to obtain spouses in exchange. So all the forms of matrimonial exchange that Lévi-Strauss analyzes in this book are as many transformations of this original principle, forms that Lévi-Strauss studies as a function of the growing complexity they exhibit in relation to the simplest sociological form that the principle of reciprocity can take, and this is the dualist organization, where a society is divided into two moieties, two classes, who exchange women according to the rule of exogamy. This elementary form, known as restricted exchange, is the absolute minimal organization of reciprocity below which no social life is possible. From there, a series of transformations follows which develop the possibilities of the initial invariant. The generalized exchange of the Australian marriage systems with 4 and 8 sections, which are in fact mere developments of the logical possibilities of the initial reciprocity. When the group, in fact, of wife givers and wife receivers are divided according to their place of residence. Then the system of the Kachin, of the highland of Burma, in which generalized exchange is combined with bride purchase, so that women circulate between groups in one direction, while bride wealth circulates in the opposite direction. And finally, a series of combinations of restricted and generalized exchange in China and India, which are in fact complex transformations of the original structure of reciprocity. The Chinese model combining restricted exchange in the peasantry and generalized exchange in the aristocracy, while the Indian model undergoes a dual evolution from generalized exchange towards hypergamy in the higher castes and towards the closure of the lower castes within a system of restricted exchange. So these arborescence of the forms of marriage bears, as you may have noted, a strong resemblance to the methodical variations of an Urform in Goethe's sense, the original form being, in that case, the exchange of women ruled by the principle of reciprocity, of which Lévi-Strauss unfolds all the logical combinations, consequences in as many morphological types of marriage alliances. And just as Goethe entertained the hope of discovering one day the Urpflanz, the original plant, the prototype from which could be derived by transformation the whole set of characteristics of all vegetal species, both actual and logically possible, Lévi-Strauss sees in the principle of reciprocity the original form of all possible types of marriage alliances, of which he propounded the law of development. And just as Goethe opposed Linnaeus in botany, because he rejected the idea of a static table of attributes, exhaustive though it may be, in favor of the deduction of a principle of transformation of biological forms from a complex initial combination. In the same way, Lévi-Strauss opposes Radcliffe Brown in the domain of social morphology when he considers as initial the structure which develops on the widest scale the logical possibilities of the principle of reciprocity, rather than retain as a point of departure the simplest forms of marriage from which the more complex would be derived. So there's a very stark difference here between Lévi-Strauss and Radcliffe Brown. By contrast with this conception of the variations as developments of a complex prototype, Lévi-Strauss adopts in the analysis of myth an entirely different approach to variations, which he claims to have borrowed from D'Arcy Thompson. D'Arcy Thompson, in his master book on growth and form, propounds to use a geometrical grid of transformation to move from the form of an organism to the form of another organism by a process of continuous deformation and without resorting to some complex initial form out of which all the other forms of organisms would be derivable. So independently of any evolutionary lineage, one can thus move from the skull of an extinct species of rhinoceros to the skull of a contemporary species of tapir, and from this to the skull of a horse. And Lévi-Strauss adopts this method to the analysis of myths. A mythical transformation, for Lévi-Strauss, is the group constituted on the one hand by the sets of variants of a myth that keeps the same structure, including by inverting it, and on the other hand, by the set of myths, often originating from neighboring societies, that can be shown to transform each other by mutually borrowing episodes, which Lévi-Strauss calls mythems, the motifs of which they will invert, or the function of which they will swap. So the transformation of organic forms and the transformations of mythems thus proceed in the same way, by a continuous series of small variations within a group. However, as Lévi-Strauss himself acknowledges, there exists a major difference between myths and organisms. And this difference is that while the specific or generic differences between organisms depend, in the end, on discontinuities introduced by the genetic code, the group of transformation within which myths are contrasted constitutes a virtual continuum upon which the analyst performs arbitrary cuts. So it is the analyst who chooses, according to his knowledge and to his imagination, in the huge math of myth and variants of myth, he will choose the mythms which will yield the highest contrastive and semantic output. So from this point of view, the variants of a myth do not carry by themselves a principle of discontinuity. In other words, the transformation by continuous variation that Darcy Thompson operates on the morphology of organisms requires that stable forms be given as templates, both at the starting point, the rhinoceros, and at the end point, the horse. This is necessary for bringing to light the physical-mathematical principles which allow to move from one to the other by a deformation without loss of continuity. There is no such thing in the structural analysis of myth, for each analyst will trace the path of a transformation which his fancy will suggest to follow. So while the mythical transformation introduces discontinuities by the means of contrastive operations upon a set of phenomenal properties relating to aspects of the world that can be shown to have common semantic properties, the anatomical transformation introduces continuity by the means of deformation exercised upon a set of phenomenologically dissimilar forms between which affinities are hypothesized. So, whether it concerns organisms, images, social types, or the semantic units of certain kinds of statements, the transformation of one form into another can thus be undertaken either in a Goethean regime or in a Thompsonian regime. In the former case, in a Goethean regime, the transformation is the development in different forms of a kind of initial blueprint, itself constructed by comparing empirical objects pertaining to a same set. In the latter case, in the Thompsonian regime, transformation is a deformation by continuous variation in a space of coordinates that applies to forms that are already given. The first method, which Lévi-Strauss follows in Les structures alimentaires de la parenté, is also the one which inspired my own approach in the book to which Stefan mentioned, Beyond Nature and Culture, where I undertook to organize the diverse forms of continuity and discontinuity between humans and non-humans out of an initial relation between what I call interiority and physicality. So I will now take the liberty of recalling these guiding lines of my reasoning in this book. Simply stated, the ontological group of transformation that I developed, Goethean in a Goethean regime, purports to contrast modes of identification, that is, framing devices that regulate habitus, guide inferences, filter perceptions, and are largely the product of the affordances which the world offers to the specifically human dispositions. A fundamental function of these framing devices is to ascribe identities by lumping together or dissociating elements of the lived world that appear to have similar or dissimilar qualities. My argument in that book is that one of the universal features of the cognitive process in which such dispositions are rooted is simply the awareness of a duality of planes between material processes, which I call physicality, and mental states, which I call interiority. And by using this universal grid, humans are in a position to emphasize or to minimize continuity and differences between humans and non-humans. And in fact, this results in a fourfold schema of ontologies that is of contrastive qualities and beings detected in human surroundings and organized into systems that I have labeled using well-worn, at least for some, in 3 of the cases, labels: animism, totemism, naturalism, and analogism. The range of identifications based on the interplay of interiority and physicality is in fact limited. When confronted with an as yet unspecified allude, I use this word allude, I borrow this concept from Vincent Descombes, who distinguishes between alter and allude. An allude is an alter which has not yet been specified by a relation. So when confronted with an as yet unspecified allude, whether human or non-human, a human cognizant subject can surmise either that this object has a similar interiority and a different physicality, and this I call animism, or that the object is devoid of interiority but possesses a kind of physicality similar to that of the subject, and this is what I call naturalism, or that this object shares with other humans and non-humans elements of physicality and interiority that are similar to his own, and this I call totemism, or finally, that this object's interiority and physicality are entirely distinct from the subject's own, even though they display small enough differences to allow for relations of correspondence. And this I call analogism, because of the part, of course, that the analogical reasoning plays in the establishment of these correspondences. Each of these combinations affords a glimpse on a more general principle governing the distribution of the continuities and discontinuities between any human subject and the objects of its environment. Each of these modes of identification serves, moreover, as a touchstone for singular configurations of cosmological systems, of conceptions of the social link, and for theories of otherness that are as many instituted expressions of more entrenched mechanisms of recognition of the other. Now, this ontological group bears a resemblance to what Lévi-Strauss sometimes calls the order of orders. That is, for him, the upper level of structural articulations of the various systems composing social life, with a slight difference that the articulation here in the model I've just sketched is not a function of an integration of levels already analytically defined, but it results from a hypothesis as to what comes first in the experience of the world, namely discerning qualities in the objects that surround us and inferring the kind of relations that they afford. However, the matrix of identifications does not work as a philosophical prime mover. Rather, it functions as a sort of experimental device that allows me to capture, thus to bring to existence, and to sort out, thus to combine, certain phenomena in order to highlight the syntax of their differences. But there is more. By adopting this device, I wanted above all to remain faithful to this basic principle of structural analysis, which holds that each variant is a variant of the other variants and not of any of them in particular, which would thus be privileged. For if I gave the ontological matrix, which I've just sketched, a fundamental position, on the other hand, none of the variants detectable in other systems, which are as many transformations of the matrix, that is, in the sociological, praxeological, epistemic, cosmological, spatial temporal domain, can claim to predominate over any other variance. And this was a requirement which I had set upon myself from the start, so as to produce a model of intelligibility of social and cultural facts that would remain as neutral as possible in relation to our own ontology, naturalism. And this is why naturalism, in this ontological matrix, is only one of the 4 ontological variants in the matrix. So structuralism in general thus provides for what is for me the fairest form of symmetrization that anthropology can afford. By symmetrization, I mean an attempt, which I think is proper to anthropology, and one of its main claims to distinction, to render compatible on an equal footing the cultural features of the observer and those of the observed. For it became clear to all lucid anthropologists early on in the development of the discipline that ethnological comparatism, whether implicit or explicit, always presupposed in one way or another that the point of view of the analyst doing the comparison encompassed the point of view of the members of the societies that were being compared, or at least that it set a convenient point of reference for its evaluation. To redress this imbalance, a number of forms of symmetrizations have been devised. The most common, apart from structural analysis, being to generalize either the range of local concepts, this is a very old forms of symmetrization, so the use of totem, mana, taboo, how, shaman, whatever, or of a local epistemic stance. I'm thinking, for instance, of Louis Dumont's idea of the hierarchical encompassment, which is based on the analysis of the Indian caste system, or Madeleine Strathern's notion of the person as an objectification of relations. And thus, in fact, these processes confer to the knowledge of the observer, of the observed, an equal, even competing status to the knowledge of the observer. Another form of symmetrization is to transform an account of a native way of thinking into a more or less systematized corpus, similar in a way to a philosophical doctrine, at least in the mode of presentation. This is also a very ancient tendency in the West, and one that even predates the former type of symmetrization, since it is a characteristic feature, it has been a characteristic feature during several centuries of a certain type of missionary anthropology. More recent cases are, for instance, the famous Philosophie Bantu of Father Placid Temples, which triggered a very heated debate among African philosophers, or even Eduardo Viveros de Castro's latest version of perspectivism, which he published in his book Métaphysique cannibale. All these forms of symmetrization are wanting for reasons that it would be too long to develop here, but the cardinal reason is that they remain an idiosyncratic exegesis which upsets and bypasses the pragmatic conditions of utterance and of reception of the propositions which reputedly provide the operationality of the practice or norm transformed into an analytical concept or a philosophical doctrine. The kind of symmetrization which structural analysis practices does not purport to generalize the range of a local concept or epistemic stance, or to offer a philosophical sort of counter-model inspired from a local way of thinking. It purports to compose a combinatorial matrix that would account for all the states of a set of phenomena by bringing to light the systematic differences which oppose its elements. So why is it a symmetrization? It is a symmetrization because, in accordance with standard structuralist practices, the totalization is never given ab initio, as the starting point from which the series of anthropology might structure the world under its imperial gaze. But it results from the always incompleted operation by the means of which cultural features, norms, institutions, qualities, propositions are constituted as variants of one another within a set. And this set may not only be reconfigured differently if new elements are added, it has no other raison d'être than to subsume the variations for which it provides the encompassing framework. So this type of symmetrization in no way claims a universalist position of detachment, for it is entirely dependent upon the multiple properties that people detect here and there in phenomena, and it thus requires nothing more in terms of a sort of overhanging epistemic point of view than acquiring some knowledge on the diversity of the object one deals with, which is, after all, a modest claim for a scholarly undertaking. So at first sight, one might think that an ontological matrix of the kind I favor cannot be the result of a bifurcation from ethnographic experience, since it appears to imply complete shift of conceptual framework. But this is not the case, and I'll conclude with that, because the opposition which is customarily made between ethnography, the acquisition of information on a specific group of people, and anthropology, as two kinds of enterprises that would refer to clearly compartmentalized methods and objects, is, I think, here misleading. Because the deductive method that I followed in proposing this ontological matrix is not entirely immune from the preliminary procedures which made it possible and which the internal economy of my argumentation led me to render invisible. Invisible, at least in the book in Beyond Nature and Culture, I rendered it visible in a later book called The Composition of Worlds. Actually, it was by a series of inductive generalization from ethnography, my ethnography and that of others, that the transformational model of Beyond Nature and Culture progressively took shape and achieved, after many episodes of trial and error, the kind of formal simplicity of an a priori proposition. And more generally, it is from the constantly enriched store of ethnological monographs and publications in general that anthropologists extract the elements which allow them to bifurcate in such or such direction. And they do so with a know-how which is all the more difficult to formalize, that it rests upon the shared mastery of another know-how, which is fieldwork practice. And fieldwork practice renders immediately familiar to us the rarely explicit procedures of the objectification process by the means of which other ethnographers have collected, filtered, and presented their data. And it is because we have done ethnography ourselves, even if our, as in the case I've just presented, our objective is an anthropological model. It is because we have done ethnography ourselves that we are able to decipher the ethnographic material that is presented in monographs and publications by other ethnographers. So this constant shuttle between abstraction and description, between induction and deduction, between direct and mediate knowledge, between local concepts and concepts with universal claims is, I think, what probably makes anthropology a very special science, a sort of art of discovery, flavored with a whiff of adventure, but a whiff of adventure that does not emanate solely from the people with whom one may occasionally share one's life, but also from the unexpectedness of the paths one chooses for being altered by others and making something out of it. Thank you for your patience.